In the late 1970s, a half-filled Coca Cola bottle in a bookshop window would become the key to unraveling a Soviet spy ring that had operated undetected in the shadow of the Pentagon for over 3 years. What federal investigators didn't know at the time was that this ordinary American soft drink was speaking a language they'd been trying to decode for months. By the time they understood what it meant, this would become one of the most methodical espionage cases of the Cold War. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had known since late 1975 that a Soviet intelligence network was operating somewhere in the greater Washington area. The evidence was circumstantial but consistent. Classified documents from the Department of Defense kept appearing in Eastern Bloc hands. Technical specifications for satellite communications systems, internal assessments of weapons procurement programs, organizational charts showing which military officers held which clearances. The kind of intelligence that helped Soviet analysts understand American capabilities piece by piece. The FBI's Washington field office opened a counterintelligence investigation in January 1976, designated Operation Quiet Pastor, assigning 6 agents to identify what they believed was an active espionage cell. For 2 years, the investigation yielded almost nothing. Standard protocols produced no obvious suspects, no suspicious financial transactions, no unexplained foreign contacts. Whoever was stealing American secrets had established a system so clean, so compartmented, that it left virtually no trace, and the agents working the case began to wonder if they were chasing shadows. Then, in August 1978, everything changed. A CIA source, whose identity would remain so closely guarded that even the FBI counterintelligence team would never learn their name, provided information to their handler during a meeting in a European capital. The source claimed that a Soviet intelligence network operating in the Washington area used commercial products as signal devices, specifically Coca Cola bottles, to indicate when material was ready for collection. The information was frustratingly vague. The source didn't know where the signal was being used, didn't know who was using it, didn't know the specific configuration or placement that constituted an active signal as opposed to just a discarded bottle. They simply knew that somewhere in the nation's capital, a Coca Cola bottle meant something more than a refreshment. When the CIA passed this intelligence to the FBI in mid-August, the reaction among the operation team was mixed. On one hand, it was the first tangible lead they'd received in 2 years, the first concrete detail about the network's operational methods. On the other hand, it was maddeningly imprecise. The Washington metropolitan area in 1978 encompassed hundreds of square miles, dozens of distinct communities, hundreds of thousands of residents, and countless businesses. Coca Cola was the most popular soft drink in America. Its distinctive glass bottles were everywhere, in grocery stores and gas stations, in trash bins and recycling containers. The idea of finding the one Coca Cola bottle that mattered among millions that didn't seemed almost absurd. The FBI expanded their investigation to include visual surveillance of what they considered high-probability areas: neighborhoods near Pentagon offices, commercial districts, suburbs with significant populations of federal employees who held security clearances. They trained agents to watch for unusual patterns, bottles placed in locations and in ways that seemed deliberate rather than random. But the task was so enormous and the resources were very limited. After weeks of expanded surveillance that produced no results, the FBI leadership began to question whether the CIA's intelligence was accurate or whether they were interpreting it correctly. By late September 1978, Operation Quiet Pastor had returned to its previous focus, still investigating, but without any clear direction forward. Special Agent Michael Reeves had been assigned to Task Team since its inception in early 1976, and by October 1978, the case had become something of an obsession. Reeves was 34 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Bureau who had worked bank robbery cases and organized crime investigations before transitioning to counterintelligence work. He was methodical by nature, the kind of investigator who kept detailed notes and revisited evidence repeatedly, looking for patterns that others might have missed. On the evening of October 12, 1978, Michael and his wife Abigail Reeves had dinner reservations at a small Italian restaurant called Angelo's near their house in Arlington. Arlington, Virginia, sat just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., a suburb where tree-lined streets and locally owned businesses masked the proximity to the nation's most sensitive government operations. Federal employees made up a significant portion of the population, and the business of government, with all its secrets and vulnerabilities, was woven into daily life. Michael and Abigail arrived at 6:45, and the hostess seated them at a table near the front window, the kind of spot that offered a view of the street and the storefronts across the way. As Agent Reeves glanced out the window while Abigail reviewed the menu, his attention was caught by the bookshop directly across the street. Literarium Books was the kind of small independent bookstore that existed in many suburban commercial districts in that era, with hand-lettered signs in the window advertising used paperbacks and local author events. But what caught Reeves's attention wasn't a book. It was a Coca Cola bottle positioned on the right side of the window display, filled about halfway with liquid. The bottle was standing upright, label angled slightly toward the street, placed neatly amongst some of the books on display. Reeves watched as the shop owner, a middle-aged man in a cardigan sweater, moved around inside preparing to close for the evening. The man pulled down the front shade and locked the door, but the Coca Cola bottle remained visible through the window, illuminated by the fading evening light. Reeves felt something shift in his mind, that particular sensation that experienced investigators recognize, the moment when a random detail suddenly seems significant. He thought about the CIA intelligence report from August, about Coca Cola bottles being used as signals. He thought about how this bottle seemed deliberately placed rather than forgotten. He thought about how the timing aligned with the shop's closing, as if the placement was meant to communicate something to someone who would see it after business hours. Throughout the meal, he kept glancing across the street at the bookshop window, at that half-filled bottle catching the streetlight. It was probably nothing, probably just a coincidence, but Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at something important. After dinner, as he and Abigail walked to their car, Reeves scanned the street. It was empty, as most businesses already closed for the day, and it were just people like him and his wife out for dinner and drinks. Agent Reeves didn't sleep well that night. He tossed and turned, thinking about that bottle in the bookshop window. At 6:45 the next morning, Michael Reeves drove slowly past Literarium Books on his way to the office. The bookshop wouldn't open until 10 o'clock, and the street was quiet in the early morning light. Just a few commuters heading toward the main roads, and a delivery truck parked 2 blocks down. Reeves slowed his car as he approached Literarium Books, looking toward the front window. The Coca Cola bottle was gone. The window display remained otherwise unchanged. The same arrangement of books on the same wooden stands, the same hand-lettered sign advertising a poetry reading scheduled for the following week. But the bottle that had been positioned so deliberately the night before had vanished sometime between last night and now, barely 12 hours later. Reeves felt his pulse quicken. He continued on to the FBI's Washington field office and immediately requested a meeting with his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge, Robert Hensley. Hensley listened to Reeves's account with the patient skepticism of a career investigator who had learned not to get excited about single observations. The supervisor acknowledged that it was interesting, but also explainable in a dozen mundane ways. Shop owner could have removed it himself. Cleaning person could have taken it out. It could be completely unrelated to their case. But Reeves pressed the point about timing. It appeared just before closing, and it was gone by morning. That was exactly the kind of signal the CIA source described. Place the indicator when material is ready, remove it once pickup is confirmed. Hensley authorized limited surveillance. 2 agents would position themselves at the restaurant that night. If another bottle appeared, they would watch what happened. If nothing happened, they would move on. That evening, October 13th, 2 FBI agents undercover as man and wife out for dinner sat at a corner table in Angelo's with a clear view of literarium books across the street. They ordered food and settled in to watch. The bookshop operated normally, the owner visible through the front window shelving books and managing the register. At 7 o'clock, the owner flipped the sign to closed and began his end-of-day routine. The agents watched carefully, but no Coca Cola bottle appeared in the window. At 7:30, the owner locked the front door and departed, the shop left standing in the dark. The FBI team agreed that another drop the next night might be too soon, so they maintained surveillance for the next few random evenings, rotating agents to avoid suspicion, but the result was the same each night. Normal business operations, routine closing procedures, no Coca Cola bottles, no suspicious activity of any kind. By October 20th, the surveillance was called off. Hensley acknowledged that Reeves might have observed something relevant, but concluded that without additional evidence, they couldn't justify the continued allocation of resources. Michael Reeves accepted the decision professionally, but privately, he couldn't let it go. The image of that bottle in the window stayed with him, the deliberateness of its placement, the timing of its appearance and disappearance. He began driving past literarium books regularly during his off-duty hours, sometimes in the morning before work, sometimes during his lunch break, sometimes in the evening after dinner. Weeks passed. November arrived with cooler temperatures and shorter days, and Arlington took on the character of approaching winter. Reeves continued his irregular surveillance, varying his routes and times to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. He saw nothing unusual. No Coca Cola bottles appeared in the window. But on the evening of December 8, 1978, nearly 2 months after his initial observation, Michael Reeves drove past literarium books at approximately 8:20 in the evening. The shop had already closed, the sign hanging in the door, the interior lights turned off. And there in the front window, positioned in exactly the same spot as before, angled in exactly the same way as before, was a Coca Cola bottle, filled halfway with liquid. Reeves pulled his car to the curb a half block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be coincidence. The placement was too specific, too identical to what he'd observed in October. Someone was using that bottle as a signal, and someone else was reading that signal and responding to it. He decided to call it in right away to the FBI duty officer, identifying himself and requesting immediate contact with SAC Hensley. By 10:30 that evening, Robert Hensley had mobilized a surveillance team from the Washington field office. The initial challenge was how to observe literarium books without being detected. The shop sat on a commercial street with limited places to conceal agents, and any obvious surveillance presence might alert whoever was using the signal system. Hensley made the decision to station 2 agents in an unmarked vehicle parked down the block, a Ford sedan that blended with other cars along the street. From this vantage point, the agents could maintain very limited visual contact with the bookshop, as their angle of sight was less than ideal, and the darkness made detailed observation difficult. The night stretched on. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The bookshop remained still and dark, and the Coca Cola bottle remained in the window. At approximately 4:55 in the morning on December 9th, something changed. Special Agent Thomas Crawford noticed what he believed was movement inside the darkened bookshop. Crawford grabbed his binoculars and focused on the front window, his partner now alert and watching as well. They couldn't see clearly who was moving inside the shop. The angle and darkness made it impossible to identify any individual, but they could see a dim light, as if someone turned on a lamp in the back. Then, as they watched, the Coca Cola bottle disappeared from the window. One moment it was there, illuminated by the streetlight, and the next moment it was gone, removed by someone inside. Crawford documented the time in his notebook, 4:57 a.m. But even as he reached for the radio to report the development, both agents realized a crucial problem with their surveillance position. They could see the front of literarium books. They could see the front window and the front door, but they had no visibility on the back of the building. They couldn't see if someone had entered from a rear entrance, couldn't see if someone was exiting right now through a back door, couldn't see the alley that ran behind the commercial buildings on this block. No one had entered or exited through the front door. Of that, they were certain. The front door had remained locked and undisturbed throughout the night. But whoever removed that bottle had been inside the building, which meant there must be access from the rear, and they had no eyes on it. By 6 o'clock that morning, when the surveillance team reported back to the FBI field office, Robert Hensley convened an emergency meeting with the rest of the team investigators. The overnight surveillance had confirmed Michael Reeves' suspicion. The Coca Cola bottle was indeed being used as a signal, and someone with access to literarium books was involved in removing it after the shop closed. But the surveillance had also revealed the operational security challenge they faced. They needed to watch both the front and the back of the building simultaneously, and they needed to do it without being detected. The solution came from Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, one of the team's more experienced surveillance specialists. She had noted that across the street from literarium books, above a hardware store, there was a second-floor apartment that appeared to be vacant. If they could rent that apartment, they'd have direct line of sight to the bookshop front, and depending on the unit's layout, they might be able to observe the entrance to the rear alley. Within 48 hours, the FBI had secured a 6-month lease on the apartment under the name of a shell corporation created for surveillance operations. The apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom unit with a living room, kitchenette, and bathroom, but its location was perfect. The front windows looked directly at literarium books, offering a clear view of the storefront and the display window. The bedroom window provided a partial view of the rear alley entrance, though the angle was imperfect. By December 12, 1978, the observation post was operational. FBI agents had installed professional surveillance equipment, including cameras with long lenses mounted on tripods, and were keeping detailed logs for documenting all activity. The apartment was staffed 24 hours a day, with rotating 2 agent teams working 8-hour shifts. Their orders were explicit: observe and document everything related to literarium books. Note everyone who entered and exited the shop. Watch for the appearance of Coca Cola bottles in the window, and if another bottle appeared, maintain continuous surveillance until someone removed it and attempt to identify that person The surveillance team settled in for what they knew might be a long wait. Espionage networks operated on their own schedules, based on the availability of intelligence and the opportunity to pass it safely. The Coca Cola bottle might appear again tomorrow, or it might not appear for weeks. The FBI's job was to be watching whenever it did. Literarium Books operated as a seemingly ordinary small business. The owner, whose name the FBI had quickly identified through property records as Ernest Caldwell, arrived each morning between 9:15 and 9:30, unlocked the front door, and opened for business at 10 o'clock. The shop's clientele was modest but consistent. Neighborhood residents browsing for books, students from the nearby community college looking for required reading, occasional dealers searching for valuable first editions. The FBI agents photographed everyone who entered, cross-referencing faces against lists of known or suspected foreign intelligence officers. Ernest Caldwell himself appeared entirely ordinary, a 63-year-old former teacher who had owned the bookshop for nearly 8 years. Background checks revealed nothing suspicious. No foreign travel, no unexplained income, no known associations with diplomatic personnel or suspected intelligence operatives. He lived in a modest house in Arlington, drove a 10-year-old Chevrolet, attended a Lutheran church on Sundays, and by all appearances was simply a man who had found a quiet way to spend his retirement years doing something he enjoyed. The surveillance continued through December. Christmas approached, and the street took on a festive character, with lights strung between street lamps and seasonal displays in shop windows. Literarium Books featured a holiday book selection in its front window. Children's stories, classic novels, gift sets of poetry, and essays. But no Coca-Cola bottles appeared. The FBI team began to wonder if somehow their presence had been detected or if the network had changed its communication method. On January 3, 1979, at approximately 6:45 in the evening, a Coca-Cola bottle appeared in the front window of Literarium Books. Special Agent David Quinn was on watch in the observation post when he spotted it, and he immediately activated the full surveillance protocol. He radioed the command post at the FBI field office, notifying them that the signal had been placed, and he began photographing the bookshop systematically, documenting the bottle's exact position and the time of its appearance. Ernest Caldwell closed the shop at 7 o'clock as usual, flipped the sign to closed, pulled down the front shade, and locked the front door. The Coca-Cola bottle remained in the window, visible and waiting. The FBI had learned from their previous surveillance attempt, and this time they were determined not to miss whoever removed the bottle or whoever might approach the bookshop from any direction. The hours passed slowly. 8 o'clock came and went, then 9, then 10. The street quieted as businesses closed and residents settled in for the evening. The surveillance team maintained their watch, cameras ready, everyone alert for any movement. At approximately 4:30 in the morning on January 4th, a car appeared approaching slowly. It was a dark-colored sedan. Special Agent Quinn, watching from the observation post, grabbed his camera and began shooting photographs as the vehicle slowed. But it didn't stop. It kept going, the same speed, down the street until it disappeared. Agent Quinn thought it was unusual, but not out of the ordinary. Then, approximately 10 minutes later, his partner watching the alley entrance from the other window confirmed visual contact. A male figure had entered the alley. He appeared to be carrying nothing, just walking purposefully in the pre-dawn darkness. The distance and poor lighting made it impossible to see details, just a silhouette of what appeared to be a man in dark clothing. For approximately 11 minutes, nothing visible happened. They watched the front window, watched the Coca Cola bottle, and waited. Then, a dim light turned on in the back of the bookshop. The agents could see a soft shadow behind the shade covering the window, just as the bottle disappeared. Someone inside had removed it, just as they had before. The light turned off, and less than a minute later, the male figure emerged from the rear alley, walking back toward the street. This time, however, he was carrying something, a small paper bag, roughly the size that might contain a paperback book. The agents watching from the observation post took photographs, trying to capture the figure's face in the dim light, but the distance and darkness defeated them. They could see that he was medium height, medium build, wearing what appeared to be a dark jacket and dark pants, but they couldn't make out facial features or other identifying characteristics. The figure disappeared out of sight quickly, and the FBI agents faced an immediate decision: follow him and risk exposing their surveillance, or maintain position and preserve their observation post for future operations. Robert Hensley had been clear in his instructions. The observation post was too valuable to compromise. If they spooked the network now, they might shut down the entire operation before the FBI could identify all the participants. The agents remained in position and let the figure walk away into the darkness. By 6 o'clock that morning, the surveillance team had documented the entire sequence of events. The signal placement at 6:45 the previous evening, the arrival of the vehicle at 4:30, the figure entering the alley and emerging later with a paper bag. They had photographs, though none showed the person's face clearly enough for identification. They had confirmation that the signal system worked exactly as they'd hypothesized: bottle placed when material was ready, removed by someone accessing the shop from the rear after pickup was completed. The surveillance had confirmed how the network operated, but it hadn't yet identified who was feeding classified information into the system. The person picking up the material was clearly a courier, someone collecting packages, but somewhere upstream was the actual source, the insider with access to classified defense documents who was betraying his country. Robert Hensley outlined the next phase of the investigation. They knew the bookshop was the drop site. They knew the Coca Cola bottles were the signal. And they knew someone picked up after the signal was placed. What they didn't know yet was who was dropping off. The FBI strategy shifted from passive observation to active identification. The surveillance team was instructed to photograph and document every person who entered Literarium books, to note what they carried in and what they carried out, and to look for anyone who might be delivering material rather than just browsing for books. The team also began conducting deep background investigations on Ernest Caldwell, the bookshop owner. Financial records showed modest income consistent with a small retail business, no unusual deposits or expenditures. Phone records showed calls to book wholesalers, local customers, his daughter in Richmond. There was nothing to suggest wealth or foreign connections, nothing that would explain why he would risk everything to serve as a conduit for Soviet intelligence. The prevailing theory was that Caldwell had been recruited or coerced, that he was being paid or blackmailed to allow his bookshop to be used as a drop site. The surveillance continued through January. The observation post across the street documented the daily rhythm of Literarium books, customers arriving and departing, Ernest Caldwell managing his business, closing procedures each evening. The FBI team photographed everyone, building a database of faces and patterns, looking for anomalies. On January 29th, the Coca Cola bottle appeared again in the window at 6:50 in the evening, just before closing time. The surveillance team activated the full protocol, cameras recording agents in position. That night, at 4:43 in the morning, a vehicle arrived and a figure entered the alley, emerging minutes later with a paper bag after the bottle had been removed from the window. The pattern was identical to the previous pickup on January 4th, and once again, the FBI maintained surveillance discipline and didn't attempt to follow the courier. But now the investigative team had a narrower window to focus on. They cross-referenced everyone who had entered literarium books in the days before the January 29th signal with everyone who had entered before the January 4th signal. The analysis produced a list of roughly 24 individuals who had visited the shop during both time periods, regular customers whose presence appeared in multiple surveillance photographs. On February 21st, another signal appeared in the window. The pickup occurred early the next morning just as before, and the FBI team added this date to their cross-reference analysis. When they compared customers who had visited the shop before all three signals, January 4th, January 29th, and February 21st, the list narrowed dramatically to just 6 individuals. 3 of these 6 were elderly women, regular customers whom the FBI quickly eliminated as suspects based on age and lack of access to classified materials. Another was a teenager, clearly too young to be working in the defense sector. That left 2 individuals who fit the profile of potential insider threats: a man in his late 30s who carried a briefcase and dressed in business attire, and a woman in her mid-40s who had visited the shop multiple times carrying what appeared to be a purse or small bag. On March 14, 1979, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the man with the briefcase entered literarium books. Special Agent Quinn, watching from the observation post, photographed him arriving. The man spent approximately 7 minutes in the shop, then departed carrying his briefcase and walking to his car, parked half a block away. The FBI team immediately made the decision to follow the suspect when he left the shop, to identify him fully and establish his connection to potential classified materials. 2 agents in an unmarked vehicle had tailed him from a distance as he drove through Arlington, eventually following him to a residential house on Crescent Drive in Alexandria. At 6:45 that evening, as Ernest Caldwell prepared to close literarium books for the day, a Coca Cola bottle appeared in the front window. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Within hours of the man's visit, the signal had been placed. By late evening on March 14th, the FBI had obtained a name through property records and motor vehicle registration of the man they followed earlier that afternoon, Walter Ashford. Within 24 hours, the background investigation on Walter Ashford had revealed the critical connection the FBI had been seeking. He was employed by the Department of Defense, working as a clerk in a Pentagon office that handled classified procurement documentation. He had security clearance to access the exact type of materials that had been appearing in Soviet hands for the past several years. The case against Walter Ashford began to solidify rapidly. Financial records showed modest income consistent with his civil service salary, but there were irregularities, a pattern of cash deposits that didn't align with obvious sources, and larger than average purchases. Through late March and early April 1979, Walter Ashford became the subject of intensive surveillance. FBI agents documented his movements from the moment he left his house each morning until he returned each evening. They observed his routine: the drive to the Pentagon, occasional lunch breaks, the evening commute home. They photographed everyone he met, every location he visited, looking for any contact with known or suspected foreign intelligence officers. Ashford appeared to live a thoroughly ordinary life. He was 41 years old, unmarried, no children, no apparent girlfriend or active social life. He went to work, came home, occasionally stopped at a grocery store or dry cleaner. On weekends, he sometimes attended a movie theater or visited a public library. There was nothing dramatic or suspicious in his behavior, nothing that would draw attention from a casual observer. But the FBI had learned not to expect dramatic behavior from successful spies. The most effective intelligence operations were precisely the ones that blended seamlessly into normal life, that aroused no suspicion and left no obvious traces. On April 11th, 1979, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Walter Ashford arrived at Literarium Books. He carried his briefcase, as he usually did. He spent approximately 8 minutes in the shop before he left. The FBI now faced a critical tactical decision. They could wait for the signal to appear in the window that evening, then wait for the pickup to occur overnight, documenting the full cycle of the operation one more time. Or they could move immediately, before Ashford had time to destroy evidence, before Caldwell had time to alert someone in the network, before whatever was in that Ashford dropped off could be collected and disappear into Soviet intelligence channels. Robert Hensley, receiving the report at FBI headquarters, weighed the options. They had been watching this operation for months. They understood how it worked. They had identified the source. What they needed now was hard evidence, everything that would prove beyond doubt that Walter Ashford was engaged in espionage. If they waited, they also risked losing the evidence. If they moved now, they had the element of surprise. Hensley made the decision. The FBI would execute arrest and search warrants immediately before any signal could be placed or any pickup could occur. They would arrest Ernest Caldwell at the bookshop, arrest Walter Ashford at his residence, and search both locations for evidence. They would also prepare to execute the signal themselves the following night, using Caldwell's cooperation if possible to attempt to identify and arrest the courier. At 5:35 in the evening on April 11th, 1979, a team of FBI agents approached the front door. They had waited for a customer to depart, ensuring that no civilians would be present during the arrest. Special Agent Robert Hensley walked in first, holding his FBI credentials visible. Inside, Caldwell looked up from the counter where he had been organizing receipts. His expression showed confusion as he saw the group of men in suits at his door. Hensley identified himself and informed Caldwell that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. Caldwell's face went pale. He began to stammer something, but Hensley continued with the Miranda warning, informing Caldwell of his right to remain silent, his right to an attorney, and the other protections guaranteed by law. Two agents moved to the back of the shop to ensure no one was hiding and that there were no rear exits being used to flee. While Caldwell was being handcuffed, other agents began executing the search warrant, looking systematically through the bookshop for the evidence that Walter Ashford had carried in earlier that afternoon. They searched behind the counter, in the storage closet, in the small office area at the back, among the shelves and displays. The search was methodical and thorough. And within a few minutes, an agent called out from the storage closet. He had found it, a manila file folder. The folder was photographed in place, then carefully removed and opened. Inside was 4 pages of photocopied documents. The agents handling the folder could see immediately that the documents bore classification markings. The word confidential stamped in red at the top and bottom of each page, and 2 marked secret. A quick examination revealed that the documents related to satellite communication systems under development by the Department of Defense, technical specifications and program assessments that would be enormously valuable to Soviet military planners trying to understand and counter American intelligence gathering capabilities. At 6 that evening, while the search of literarian books was being completed, FBI agents executed a simultaneous arrest at Walter Ashford's residence on Crescent Drive. A team of 6 agents approached the house, noting that lights were on inside and Ashford's car was parked in the driveway. When agents knocked on the front door and announced their presence, identifying themselves as federal officers, there was a moment of silence from inside, then the sound of movement. The door opened partially, and Walter Ashford appeared, still dressed in the business attire he had worn to work that day. His expression showed immediate alarm when he saw the number of agents at his door. When the lead agent informed Ashford that he was under arrest for espionage-related offenses and attempted to enter the residence, Ashford's initial reaction was to push the door closed. But agents had positioned themselves to prevent this, and within seconds, Ashford was secured, handcuffed, and being read his Miranda rights in his own living room, while other agents began executing the search warrant for his residence. The search of Ashford's house produced additional evidence that would prove crucial to the prosecution. In a bedroom closet, concealed inside a shoebox beneath several other boxes, agents found a Minox camera, the type of miniature camera that had become synonymous with Cold War espionage. The Minox was small enough to fit in a pocket, designed specifically for photographing documents quickly and discreetly. Along with the camera, agents found several rolls of exposed film, still undeveloped. In a desk drawer in Ashford's home office, agents discovered a spiral-bound notebook containing what appeared to be coded notations. The entries consisted of dates, abbreviations, and numbers that didn't immediately make sense, but that counterintelligence analysts would later interpret as a record-keeping system, possibly tracking what documents had been photographed or delivered, or recording payments received. The notebook would become important evidence, demonstrating the systematic nature of Ashford's espionage activities over an extended period. Both Ernest Caldwell and Walter Ashford were transported separately to the FBI's Washington field office for processing and interrogation. They were placed in different rooms, kept isolated from each other, and advised of their rights before any questioning began. The FBI's strategy was to leverage the evidence they'd already gathered to encourage cooperation, particularly from Caldwell, who appeared to be more of a facilitator than a primary actor in the espionage network, and who might be willing to provide information in exchange for consideration in sentencing. Ernest Caldwell, visibly shaken by the arrest and the seriousness of the charges he faced, requested an attorney. When a lawyer arrived within 2 hours, there was a private consultation, and the attorney clearly advised Caldwell that his best option was cooperation. Caldwell made the decision to provide a full statement to FBI investigators. Over the course of several hours on the evening of April 11th and continuing into the early morning of April 12th, Caldwell described his involvement in the espionage operation. According to Caldwell's account, he had been approached approximately 3 years earlier, sometime in early 1976, by a man who introduced himself only as Michael. The man had been well-dressed, professional in manner, and had come into the bookshop as an apparent customer before eventually engaging Caldwell in conversation. After several visits over the course of a few weeks, Michael had made his proposal. He would pay Caldwell $500 per month in cash if Caldwell would allow his bookshop to be used for what Michael described as discreet exchanges of business documents. Michael claimed to represent corporate clients who needed to exchange proprietary information confidentially, and he suggested that the bookshop, with its low traffic and trusted community presence, would be an ideal neutral location for such exchanges. Caldwell admitted to investigators that he had suspected from the beginning that something illegal might be involved, perhaps industrial espionage or corporate intelligence gathering, but he claimed he never imagined it involved classified government documents or Soviet intelligence operations. The money had been attractive. $500 a month in cash was significant supplemental income for a small bookshop owner operating on modest margins. The system Michael proposed seemed relatively simple and passive. When someone delivered material to the shop, Caldwell was to place a Coca Cola bottle, filled halfway with soda, in the front window display before closing for the day. The bottle was to be positioned on the right side of the window, angled slightly toward the street. This would signal that material was ready for pickup. Michael had provided Caldwell with a key to give to the person who would be picking up the material. That person would enter through the back door overnight, after the shop was closed and dark, retrieve whatever had been left, and exit the same way. Caldwell's only responsibility was to facilitate the drop-offs and place the signal. He wasn't to ask questions, wasn't to examine the material being passed, and wasn't to have any direct involvement beyond providing access and communication through the bottle signal. Caldwell described the few occasions when he had actually seen the courier, the person who picked up the material, or at least one of the people who were couriers. It had happened only 3 or 4 times in 3 years, instances when the courier had apparently decided to enter through the front door the next day rather than the back during the night, perhaps to vary his routine or because something about the back entrance seemed unsafe. Caldwell's descriptions were frustratingly vague. A white male, medium height and build, perhaps 35 to 45 years old. Dark hair worn short, clean-shaven, no distinguishing marks or features that Caldwell could remember. The man had never spoken to Caldwell, had simply retrieved the material and departed. Caldwell didn't know his name, didn't know where he lived, didn't know anything about his identity beyond these basic physical characteristics. When FBI investigators asked Caldwell about Walter Ashford specifically, Caldwell confirmed that Ashford had been the one who delivered material to the bookshop over the 3 years of the operation. Caldwell had never known Ashford's name until the FBI told him during questioning, had never had a real conversation with him beyond brief pleasantries about books. Ashford would come into the shop, leave the material by handing it directly to Caldwell with minimal interaction. Caldwell would then place it in the storage closet and place the signal that evening before closing, and the pickup would occur overnight. Caldwell couldn't say how many times Ashford had made drops. His memory was imprecise on this point, but he estimated it had been at least a dozen times over the past 2 or 3 years. Walter Ashford's response to interrogation was dramatically different from Caldwell's. When FBI agents attempted to question him on the evening of April 11th, after advising him of his rights, Ashford denied any knowledge of espionage, denied passing classified documents, and denied any connection to Soviet intelligence operations. When confronted with the evidence found in the bookshop, the classified documents that investigators had already determined came from his Pentagon office, Ashford claimed he had no idea how those documents had gotten there. He suggested that someone must be framing him, that he had simply gone to the bookshop to buy a book and had nothing to do with any classified materials. When confronted with the evidence found in his home, the Minox camera, the film, and the notebook with coded entries, Ashford's denials became less specific. He claimed the camera had been a gift, that he used it for hobby photography, and that he knew nothing about any codes or espionage activities. As the interrogation continued, and the weight of evidence became increasingly difficult to explain away, Ashford invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. From that point forward, he refused to answer any questions or provide any cooperation to the investigation. With Ernest Caldwell in custody and cooperative, the FBI had an opportunity to attempt to identify and arrest the courier who picked up material from the bookshop. The plan was straightforward. Use Caldwell's cooperation to place the Coca Cola bottle signal in the window, exactly as would happen after a legitimate drop. Then station FBI agents inside literarium books overnight to arrest whoever came to make the pickup. If the courier followed his usual pattern and appeared in the early morning hours to retrieve what he believed was waiting material, he would find himself facing federal agents instead. On the evening of April 12, 1979, approximately 24 hours after the initial arrests, FBI agents prepared the operation with careful attention to detail. They wanted everything to appear exactly as it would during a normal signal placement. At 6:45 in the evening, Caldwell placed a Coca Cola bottle in the front window of literarium books, positioned on the right side and angled toward the street, matching the configuration that had been used for previous signals. The shop's exterior was left exactly as it would be after Caldwell closed for the day, lights turned off, shade pulled down, everything appearing normal and undisturbed. Inside the darkened bookshop, 4 FBI agents took up concealed positions. 2 agents positioned themselves behind the tall bookshelves near the back of the store, where they had clear views of both the front door and the storage area where material had typically been left. Another agent concealed himself in the storage closet where the documents had been found. The 4th agent was stationed in the small office area at the back of the shop, near the rear entrance, ready to intercept anyone who entered through the back door. All 4 agents were armed. Their instructions were clear. Remain concealed, allow the courier to enter and move toward the pickup location, then identify themselves as federal agents and make the arrest. The trap was set. Now it was a matter of waiting. The hours passed slowly in the darkened bookshop. The only sound, the occasional creak of the building settling or the muted noise of traffic from the street outside. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The agents inside the shop maintained their positions, uncomfortable but disciplined, trying to remain absolutely still and silent so as not to create any indication that the building was occupied. 3 o'clock passed, then 4, then 4:30. The early morning hours when previous pickups had consistently occurred came and went with no sign of the courier. No car appeared on the street, no figure entered the alley, no key turned in the back door. The bookshop remained empty except for the FBI agents waiting in the darkness. By 6:30, as dawn began to brighten the sky and early morning traffic started appearing on the streets outside, it became clear that no one was coming. The FBI team maintained the surveillance through the morning and into the afternoon of April 13th, keeping agents concealed inside the shop in case the courier appeared during daylight hours, but the result remained the same. No pickup occurred. Either the courier had somehow learned of the arrests and recognized that the signal was a trap, or there was some additional signal or communication method that the FBI hadn't identified, some way for the network to confirm that a drop was genuine before attempting a pickup. Perhaps there was a secondary signal that Caldwell had failed to mention or didn't know about. Perhaps the courier had tried to contact Caldwell through some other channel and had been alerted when Caldwell didn't respond. Perhaps the arrest of Ashford had already been noticed by Soviet intelligence handlers, and they had immediately instructed all their operatives to cease activities and avoid any established drop sites. Robert Hensley, reviewing the failed operation with his team on the afternoon of April 13th, acknowledged the frustration but also recognized the limits of what they'd accomplished. They had arrested the source who had been passing classified information for years. They had shut down an established drop site that had facilitated dozens of successful document transfers. They had recovered classified documents and evidence of systematic espionage. They hadn't gotten the courier, but they had disrupted the network significantly. Without the bookshop as a functioning drop site, without Walter Ashford providing new intelligence, the Soviet operation in this sector had been dealt a serious blow. The case against Walter Ashford moved forward through the federal court system with the methodical pace that espionage prosecutions require. Prosecutors from the Department of Justice's Internal Security Section built a comprehensive case, assembling the surveillance evidence, the physical evidence recovered from the bookshop and Ashford's residence, the testimony of Ernest Caldwell, and the damage assessment conducted by Department of Defense counterintelligence analysts. That damage assessment determined that Ashford had potentially compromised dozens of classified documents over approximately 3 years, beginning sometime in 1976. The documents related primarily to satellite communications and military procurement programs, exactly the kind of intelligence that Soviet military planners needed to understand American capabilities and develop countermeasures. Ashford's trial began in October 1979 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. His defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the documents could have been placed in the bookshop by someone else, that the camera found in his residence was for legitimate personal photography, and that the prosecution couldn't definitively prove that Ashford had intended to pass classified information to a foreign power. But the prosecution's case was thorough and compelling. The surveillance photographs showed Ashford entering the bookshop. The folder found in the bookshop contained documents that came from Ashford's Pentagon office, documents that he had access to and that bore his office's document control markings. The Minox camera and unexposed film found in his home were consistent with espionage tradecraft. The notebook with coded entries suggested systematic record-keeping over an extended period. Ernest Caldwell testified for the prosecution as part of his cooperation agreement, describing the operation of the drop site and confirming that Walter Ashford had been the one individual who delivered material to the bookshop on multiple occasions. Caldwell's testimony was damaging, providing the jury with a clear understanding of how the espionage network had operated and how Ashford's actions fit into that larger system. On November 8, 1979, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession, and transmission of classified documents and related offenses. Walter Ashford showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. Sentencing occurred in January 1980, with the federal judge citing the seriousness of the offenses and the damage to national security in imposing a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Ernest Caldwell, in recognition of his cooperation and his relatively peripheral role, received 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after serving 2 years. The question of who had recruited Walter Ashford, who the courier was, and what happened to the broader Soviet intelligence network remained largely unanswered. The FBI's investigation continued for several more months after the trial, with agents attempting to identify the courier through analysis of surveillance photographs and by cross-referencing Caldwell's vague description with databases of known intelligence officers and suspected operatives. But without a clear photograph, without Ashford's cooperation, and without any other leads to follow, the courier remained unidentified. Whoever he was, he had successfully evaded the FBI's trap and disappeared back into whatever cover life he maintained, presumably continuing to work for Soviet intelligence in some other capacity or returning to the Soviet Union when the network was compromised. The case remained partially classified for many years after the convictions, with the Department of Defense requesting that many details remain sealed to avoid revealing the full extent of compromised documents and the specific capabilities that had been exposed. For Michael Reeves, the agent whose observation during dinner had initiated the breakthrough, the case represented a career highlight and a reminder of the importance of vigilance and attention to detail in counterintelligence work. In later years, after portions of the case were declassified, Reeves would occasionally be asked about that evening at Angelo's restaurant and what had made him notice the Coca Cola bottle when thousands of other people had walked past the same bookshop window without seeing anything unusual. His answer was always similar. It wasn't genius or intuition, it was simply a matter of staying alert to patterns and anomalies and being willing to investigate something that seemed slightly out of place, even when it would have been easier to dismiss it as coincidence.